All right. Good afternoon. So I'll be looking at the impact of the U.S. political system on its environmental policy, um, and I'll try and be as brief as possible. So I'll just highlight the research objectives and the research questions. So the objectives are to determine the U.S. political system and its influence on environmental policy formulation and implementation, to examine the role of presidency and impact of administrative transition on environmental policy, to investigate the influence of Congress and the President in environmental policy, and to analyze the impact of environmental interest groups on policy formulation and implementation. So the main research question is, does the US government or political structure limit the formulation and implementation of environmental policies? And under the main question, we have the sub-questions, which are, do administrative transitions post-elections affect the state of environmentalism in the US? Do the roles of Congress and that of the President override in environmental policy formulation and implementation? Does federalism in the US also affect the same? And does bipartisan politics affect the same? So the theory that I used to conduct my study was a systems theory by David Easton, and he basically talks about input, the process, and then the output. So in this case, in relation to my research, the input is environmental interest groups. So a problem was identified whereby the US was starting to face environmental challenges, and the interest groups took it up. And then the process that happened was that environmental policies were formulated by the federal government, and the output were the policies that now the US uses today. This is the structure of my work. The chapter 1 basically looks at the political systems in general and environmental policy. Chapter 2 focuses on key environmental policies in the United States. Chapter 3 looks at federal system, presidency, Congress, environmental policy. Basically looks at the political structure of the US and how that affects environmental policy. And chapter 4, I look at the influence of bipartisan politics, public opinion interest groups, and administrative changes, whereby I look at different administrations. I look at President Jimmy Carter versus President Ronald Reagan. I look at President George Bush, W. Bush, and Barack Obama. So today, the presentation, I decided to just answer the questions that are part of my research, that are the basis of my research. So does the US government or political structure limit the formulation and implementation of environmental policies? And the response, the final research of my work was able to come up with a conclusion that yes, it does. So the US environmental structure has separation of powers, checks and balances, which uses the Madisonian model. And as we know, the United States has 50 states. It's a federal government state. We have the national government and the states. Congress also has the main power to come up with legislation. Though as much as Congress is able to do that, the president has the ability to negate the efforts of the Congress. Again, Congress, according to the Constitution, has the ability to override the president's rule or laws if they have like a good majority, two-thirds majority when it comes to voting. Again, in Congress, they are able to have their own limitations due to the committees and subcommittees that are there. So through these committees and subcommittees, you can see that they either promote, delay, or oppose legislation. So that also affects environmental legislation. So does bipartisan politics affect the US environmental policies? Yes, it does. This is because Republicans are more conservative, so they're more skeptical about environmental matters, whereby the Democrats are more liberal and they welcome environmental policies. Again, Congress is made up of different individuals who are from two different parties. So they're either Democrats or Republicans. And because of that, when it comes to passing of laws, you'll find that if Congress is full of Republicans, most likely they'll be more skeptical about environmental policies, which means that laws will be hard to pass. So for instance, we find that someone like President Trump, he's Republican, and President Biden is Democrat. So when it comes to the issue of the Paris Agreement, you find that President Trump was not in for the Paris Agreement and he withdrew from it. And once President Biden got into power, he was able to get it back on. Unfortunately, again, when President Trump got into power, he withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement. Again, do administrative transitions post-elections affect environmental policies? Yes, it does. This is because every president comes in with their own manifestos. For instance, someone like Trump, he came in with America First, whereby for him, the economical progression of the US was more important than protecting the environment. And so because the president has a privilege to sign legislation through executive orders and use of veto power, that's how we see someone like President Barack Obama. He was able to sign in the US into the Paris Agreement without even having to go through Congress. Again, under the presidency, we find that there's a lot of bureaucracy when it comes to executive agencies. This is mostly based on the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, whereby the president has the liberty to choose the person that is going to chair the EPA, and also the Department of Interior, the Department of Energy. These departments are very crucial. Again, the president's office has a budget. And so if the president is pro-environment, that means that the budget under his office can go to environmental policy and other initiatives that could help keep the environment clean. So I looked at some case studies. I looked at President Jimmy Carter. Now, this is in line with administrative changes. So I looked at President Jimmy Carter as a case study. He was a Democrat, and he introduced the National Energy Act, and he also was into mining. Again, he was also interested in the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. So for him, he was trying to ensure that somehow he's protecting the environment now that he's a Democrat. Pardon me. For Ronald Reagan, for him, he was a Republican, meaning for him, he was anti-environment, and he wanted to propagate economical progression of the United States. Though even as much as he was that, he was able to have some legislations passed when he was still in president, like the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Superfund Amendment, the Clean Water Act Amendment. As much as this was done by Congress, by overriding his veto. Again, this is where we find that sometimes the Congress is able to override something that the president was not up for. Again, still under his term, he signed, the Senate signed and ratified the Montreal Protocol on ozone depletion, ensuring that they're protecting the environment. Again, the other case study that I looked at was President George W. Bush, who was Republican, and President Barack Obama. So Bush, for him, he was pro-development. Again, he was into mining. He wanted to ensure that the United States was maximizing on as much as they can when it comes to energy through oil. On the other end, President Obama, he was more environmentally minded. He's the one that got the United States into the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, which he did by passing the Congress. He also pledged to support the Green Climate Fund, which was aimed at reducing carbon pollution. He also launched an ambitious target to reduce greenhouse gases to 26% below 2005 levels by this year, 2025. The other question was, do the roles of Congress and that of the President override in environmental policy formulation and implementation? From my research, I was able to find out that yes, it does. There's a lot of overriding when it comes to this. Why? Because Congress is more powerful when it comes to legislation vis-a-vis the president, because Congress is able to also override a president's decision when it has a good majority, as I said, a two-thirds majority. So for instance, we have like a case study here of 1970, whereby the Congress overrode President Nixon's veto of the 1972 Water Pollution Control Act amendment, whereby for him, he saw that it was too costly. But then the Congress was able to override that. Again, we find a case study of President George W. Bush, who wanted to open the Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil and gas exploration, but then Congress was not for it and they rejected that. We also see President Reagan's administration, whereby he wanted to weaken the EPA enforcement by cutting back environmental regulations. However, Congress refused to cut the EPA's budget, forcing the administration to restore funding for Superfund cleanups and maintaining stricter air and water protection. Again, we find a president like Bill Clinton, who supported the Kyoto Protocol, but the US Senate passed the Bragg-Hagel resolution, stating that the US would not ratify to any international climate treaty that harmed the economy. So again, we see that the president wanted to ensure that there's less pollution, but the Senate at that particular point, the majority, was up for the economy. They didn't want anything that was going to disrupt that. So because of that, like the US never ratified the Kyoto Protocol. It signed, but it never ratified. Again, we find President Obama pursuing climate regulations through the EPA. He had the Clean Power Plan, which he started in 2015. However, the majority of the Congress during Barack Obama's time was not Democratic, they were Republican. And because of that, he was not able to pass as much laws as he wanted to. And so for him, he had to try as much as possible to use executive power to get the environmental agenda going. Again, we also find someone like President Donald Trump. He attempted major deregulation. For instance, the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, which was not taken very well by not just the individuals in the country, but also interest groups and other companies who felt that the US still staying under the Paris Agreement was good for it, not just domestically, but also internationally, because it would give the US a winning power and more of making it a lead in the world when it comes to environmental matters. So like in 2020, the Congress refused to defund renewable energy programs that Trump had targeted. Again, we find that Congress lacked the votes to pull the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement, as much as President Trump wanted to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. So again, this is not something that was taken well by everyone in Congress. We also find that Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, of which President Biden was not 100% into it. And then we find like the last question, does federalism in the US affect formulation and implementation of domestic and international environmental agreements? I say yes. Why? Because as much as laws are made by the national government, yes, the state governments are supposed to ensure that they implement. But then there are factors that influence that, including the state's wealth. If a state is not wealthy enough to support some environmental policies that are being passed in the national government, then it won't do it. Again, if a state feels that they don't have a lot of environmental problems, that they don't see a need to implement some legislations that may be passed, even if they're international. Then we find a very major case that dictated a lot and gave a lot of power to the US EPA, which was the famous Massachusetts versus EPA case in 2007, whereby the EPA was given mandate to control green gas house pollution. All right. So now when it comes to public opinion, see that the American citizens are pro-environment. They actually want the environment protected over economic development. They also, interest groups in terms of environmental NGOs also do this by lobbying, ensuring that some legislations are passed through them lobbying. Also, business and industry interest groups. We find that even when Trump wanted to have the US withdraw from the Paris Agreement the first time, companies like Nestle and just big companies in the US were not for it, and they wanted to still stay as a part of the Paris Agreement. But the president had his own agenda. Now, the challenges that we see in all this, in the implementation and the formulation, is the politics that is in the United States, both in the Congress and in the executive. The lack of urgency towards tackling global warming and climate change. This is mostly seen by the Republicans, who don't see climate change as a big deal. For them, they don't see it as anything harmful. And policy reversals due to administrative changes. We see that 1 minute the US is a part of Paris Agreement, the next minute President Trump comes in and he withdraws. So because of that, policies are not able to be well implemented. And then we find economic advancement of environmental protection, which is a major challenge even when it comes to the Trump administration, in that for him he's into drilling and going that side when it comes to energy instead of protecting the environment. Yeah, so some of the recommendations that I made were environmental challenge are a major challenge, and prioritizing the environment of our politics is important to ensure that the environment stays protected. You know that the US is the second highest emitting, the second highest GHG emitter in the world after China. Then hiring experts into environmental agencies. We see that there's something like the EPA is very important, and when the president hires their own peer instead of someone who's an expert, then they're not able to make the right choices when it comes to environmental protection. And then the US being sustainable in terms of balancing between economic growth and environmental protection. And that is it that I have for today. So I'll try and generalize like the questions and just try and answer them all together. So when it comes to the questions with regards to looking at President Trump and President Biden, actually throughout chapter 3, I've talked about them a lot, like when it comes to the role of presidents in shaping environmental policy, right from page 168, where I talk about President Trump's first term and him rolling back like 98 environmental rules and regulations. I also talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. So basically, as much as I didn't take President Trump and President Biden as a case study, they're throughout chapter 3, meaning that my research is up to date. I'm actually focusing also on up to date, up to his second term currently. So I mention him on those pages. I also talk about his administration in 2020 on page 173. Basically, he's all over, him together with President Biden. I do try my best to ensure that I've included their term up to date so that my research is also up to date. It's not just ending at President Obama. So that's about those two presidents. So there was a question on the difference between Biden and Trump administration and environmental policy. The difference is that Biden is a Democrat, but Trump is a Republican. So just by the basis of them having two different political ideologies, that means even that their approach to environmental policies is very different. So Biden was more into ensuring that there's progression economically, but at the same time ensuring that the environment stays protected. But as we've seen with President Trump, both from his first term and the term that he's on currently, he's more focused on economical progression. However, when it comes to this study, I didn't want to focus on is it environmental progression versus economic progression. I didn't want to look at environment versus economy, because that is also like a whole topic on itself. But I do mention that the two ideologies that both presidents have, of course, make them different. There was a question that was talking about the factor which is most significant when it comes to the environment in the United States. So I talk about the political system, which is made up of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So it's hard to separate them because that's how the political system is made up in the United States. And we can't restructure that because that is how the United States structures itself. And so when it comes to what is most significant between the three, I'd say that, as I'd mentioned during my presentation, that Congress is seen to have more power than the president on the basis of Congress is able to override or overturn a president's legislature as long as it has like a major backup in Congress, in Senate, like 2/3 of the votes as long as they reach like the 2/3 of the votes, they're able to veto even a president's remark or legislation. All right, there was a question that was asking about whether it's possible to change. As I've said, it's the only thing that the United States can do is, of course, incorporate both environmental protection and economic progression through sustainable growth. That's the only way that the United States is able to still ensure that it's growing, and it doesn't have to choose between environmental protection and economic growth, because that is usually the major factor. So incorporating that and having like sustainable growth is what the United States should be able to aim at in terms of a recommendation. All right. I was told to mention about a case study on how the federal system plays about, and what I wanted to mention about was the Clean Power Plan. So this was an Obama initiative, and I mentioned that in on page 124, where the conclusion is that how the plan was not able to hold water because it faced a lot of objection from Senate. So right from page 118, I talk about the Clean Power Plan, and I mentioned that as much as it was President Obama's initiative to try and reduce emissions from coal burning power plants, he also faced opposition when it comes to the federal states, because some states felt that the economy is held by the coal plants. So limiting their emission means that the economic progression is going to slow down. And so because of that, you also face that kind of opposition. So that is how also federalism plays a role when it comes to environmental policies or initiatives that presidents can actually come up with. And so they're not able to hold water. All right. I was asked to address why I did not study President Trump. I did write a lot about President Trump. He's in my paper. Just that I didn't make him as a case study per se. Reason being, what I wanted to showcase is that the problem that, or the issue that the United States is facing right now in terms of always having to choose between bipartisan politics or Congress and the majority of the people that are ruling Congress, that it's not a now problem. It's been there even during Jimmy Carter time. It's been there. It's a problem that is still ongoing. As much as the United States has grown environmentally and economically, it's the world hegemon, but still this problem is persistent. So that is what I wanted to showcase, that as much as we are in 2025 right now, those problems of the 90s are still following the United States. So that is what I wanted to showcase. But again, still, I do mention what has been happening all through the years up until 2025, where we are right now. I hope I've been able to address all the questions. I have. All right. Thank you so much for that opportunity.
Great. Thanks a lot.